The steel gates of Rivertown Penitentiary clanged shut behind Ryan Carter with a heavy, metallic echo that seemed to shake the air. It was a sound that sent a chill down the spine of every newcomer, a grim reminder of where they were. For Ryan, it was just another step in a long, unwanted journey. The guard beside him muttered something under his breath, probably a snide comment about the quiet way Ryan carried himself. The man didn't look like much, thin, a little pale, and with an expression so neutral it was almost forgettable. That suited Ryan just fine. Inside the gates, the prison yard stretched out like a bleak, chaotic world of its own. Groups of men stood in clusters, their faces hard and weathered by years of fighting for survival. Fences topped with razor wire loomed over everything, trapping everyone in a place where only the strong survived. Ryan wasn't like the others. He wasn't hulking or loud, and he didn't have the tough look most men in Rivertown wore like armor. He walked with his head slightly down, his steps deliberate but unassuming. From the moment he entered the yard, eyes followed him. This was the way of Rivertown. Every new inmate was sized up, judged, and categorized in seconds. Was he strong? Weak? A threat? A target? For Derek the Hammer Reynolds, it was obvious. The new guy was easy prey. Derek was the kind of man who thrived in Rivertown. He was built like a tank, with arms that looked like they could crush steel. His face, scarred from years of fights, was a permanent scowl. He ruled the yard, not just with his size but with his reputation. The guards turned a blind eye to his antics. After all, keeping someone like Derek happy meant fewer problems for them. From his usual spot in the yard, a makeshift throne of stacked crates near the weightlifting area, Derek spotted Ryan immediately. He leaned back, a smirk spreading across his face. He had seen plenty of guys like Ryan come through these gates. Quiet ones, the ones who thought they could keep to themselves and survive by staying invisible. It never worked. Derek liked to break them first. It was his way of setting the tone, reminding everyone who was in charge. Fresh meat, he muttered to his crew, a gang of equally rough-looking men who laughed on cue. They all followed Derek's lead. It was safer that way. Ryan shuffled across the yard, clutching the small bundle of belongings he'd been issued. A threadbare blanket, a toothbrush, and a pair of worn-out shoes. His steps were measured, almost slow, like he wasn't in a hurry to get anywhere. He glanced around briefly but avoided meeting anyone's gaze. Derek watched him closely. "Look at him," he said, loud enough for those nearby to hear. "Skinny little thing. Won't last a week." The men around him laughed, but Ryan didn't react. If he heard Derek's comment, he gave no sign. This irritated Derek. He was used to people reacting, flinching, looking away, or showing some sign of fear. But Ryan's indifference was almost insulting. By the time Ryan reached the far corner of the yard, where he found an empty bench and sat down, Derek had already made up his mind. He would make an example of the new guy. Not today, but soon. Inside Rivertown, routine ruled. Mornings started early with the harsh blare of a siren, signaling breakfast in the mess hall. The food was barely edible, but it was better than nothing. After that, inmates were assigned tasks: cleaning, kitchen duty, or factory work. Free time in the yard came in the afternoons. Ryan's first week followed this routine. He moved through the halls quietly, doing his best to avoid drawing attention. He sat at the far end of the dining tables, kept his head down during work shifts, and chose the most isolated spot in the yard to spend his free time. But no matter how hard he tried to stay invisible, Derek had his eyes on him. It started with small things. One day, as Ryan lined up for lunch, Derek and his crew cut in front of him. Derek bumped into him hard enough to knock the tray out of his hands. "Watch where you're going," Derek said, his voice dripping with mockery. Ryan didn't respond. He simply picked up his tray, cleaned the mess, and got back in line. That night, Ryan returned to his bunk to find his blanket missing. He didn't say a word. Instead, he wrapped himself in his jacket and went to sleep. Derek was testing him, seeing how far he could push. And Ryan's silence only encouraged him. A week later, Derek decided it was time to up the game. He approached Ryan in the yard, his crew following close behind. Ryan was sitting on a bench, staring at the ground, lost in thought. "Hey, new guy," Derek called out. His voice boomed, drawing the attention of nearby inmates. Ryan looked up slowly, his expression calm. "You deaf or something?" Derek said, standing over him. Ryan didn't answer. Derek's crew chuckled. "Looks like he doesn't talk much," one of them said. Derek leaned in closer, his shadow falling over Ryan. "I'm talking to you," he said, his tone harder now. "You got a name?" "Ryan," he replied simply. "Ryan, huh?" Derek repeated, his voice mocking. "Well, Ryan, let me explain how things work around here. See, I run this yard. You want to survive? You're gonna have to learn some respect." Ryan held his gaze, his face unreadable. Derek waited for a reaction, but there was none. The lack of fear, the calmness in Ryan's eyes, it was infuriating. "Guess I'll have to teach you," Derek said, straightening up. Despite Derek's attempts to intimidate him, Ryan didn't seem to change. He went about his days quietly, sticking to the edges of the yard, avoiding conflict. But Derek wasn't done. Over the next few days, he continued to harass Ryan. He knocked over his tray in the mess hall, shoved him in the hallways, and spread rumors about him. Ryan endured it all without complaint. To the other inmates, it looked like he was just another victim, another weakling trying to survive. But there was something different about the way Ryan carried himself. Even when Derek cornered him, Ryan never flinched. He didn't cower, didn't beg, didn't fight back. He simply stood his ground, silent and steady. And for some reason, this unnerved Derek more than he cared to admit. "Hey, new guy." Derek's voice cut through the yard like a whip, loud and sharp. Conversation stopped mid-sentence, and heads turned toward the source. The tension in the air was immediate and heavy. Ryan Carter had been walking along the fence, his hands tucked into the pockets of his worn-out prison-issued pants. He didn't respond right away, pausing for a moment as if considering whether to acknowledge the call. Slowly, he turned to face Derek. His expression was calm, almost blank, as though he didn't understand what all the fuss was about. "You deaf or just stupid?" Derek took a step closer, his towering frame casting a long shadow in the afternoon sun. Behind Derek, his crew laughed on cue. They weren't just followers, they were enforcers, ready to back up their leader with fists and intimidation. But Derek rarely needed help. His size and reputation usually did the job. Ryan tilted his head slightly, his gaze steady but not challenging. He didn't say a word. "When I talk, you listen," Derek growled, his voice low and threatening. Ryan's lack of reaction was unsettling. Most men would have stammered an apology or tried to appease Derek. Some would have gotten angry, maybe even thrown a punch in a desperate show of defiance. But Ryan did none of that. He simply turned back toward the fence and continued his slow walk, as if Derek and his gang weren't even there. The yard buzzed with murmurs. No one ignored the hammer. Derek's jaw tightened, and his eyes narrowed. "You think you're too good to talk to me," he called out, his voice rising. Ryan didn't respond. That first encounter set the tone for the days that followed. Derek wasn't a man to let things go. His pride had taken a hit in front of the entire yard, and he wasn't about to let some skinny, quiet newcomer get away with making him look weak. Derek decided to make Ryan his personal project. It started small. The next morning in the mess hall, Ryan stood quietly in line, holding his tray. Derek and his crew barged in front of him, pushing him aside without so much as a glance. Ryan stepped back, steadying himself, but said nothing. When it was his turn to get food, Derek bumped into him so hard that Ryan's tray slipped from his hands and clattered to the floor. The sound echoed through the hall, drawing the attention of everyone around. "Careful, new guy," Derek said, smirking. "Don't want you making a mess." Ryan bent down, picked up his tray, and walked away. For Derek, this wasn't enough. He wanted a reaction, a sign that Ryan was afraid of him. Over the next week, he escalated his efforts. One afternoon, as Ryan sat on a bench near the yard's far corner, Derek approached with his crew in tow. "Comfy, Carter?" Derek asked, leaning over him. Ryan looked up briefly but didn't respond. "I said, are you comfy?" Derek's voice was louder now, his tone mocking. Ryan remained silent. "Guess you don't need this, then," Derek said, grabbing the thin, tattered blanket Ryan had draped over his shoulders. Ryan didn't move to stop him. He simply watched as Derek threw the blanket to one of his lackeys, who laughed and tossed it onto the ground. The other inmates watched from a distance, curious but careful not to get involved. Everyone in Rivertown knew better than to cross Derek. The harassment continued. In the showers, Derek cornered Ryan, slamming a hand against the tiled wall beside his head. "You think you're better than me, huh?" he demanded. Ryan's eyes flicked to Derek's hand, then back to his face. "No," he said simply. The single word caught Derek off guard. It wasn't defiant or sarcastic. It was just, neutral. Derek stepped closer, his breath hot and foul. "Then why don't you act like it?" Ryan didn't answer. He stepped aside, grabbed his towel, and walked away. By the end of the week, Derek was fuming. He had tripped Ryan in the lunch line, stolen the small notebook Ryan kept in his pocket, and even torn up the only photo Ryan had, a faded picture of a woman and a little boy. Through it all, Ryan never retaliated. He never yelled, never complained. It was infuriating. Derek prided himself on his ability to break people. Most inmates crumbled after just one or two encounters with him. Some begged for mercy, while others tried to fight back and failed miserably. But Ryan didn't fit into either category. He wasn't broken, but he wasn't fighting back either. He just endured. The other inmates started to notice. "Carter's got guts," one man whispered to another in the yard. "Don't know why, but Derek can't seem to shake him." "Guts or stupidity," the other replied. Even Derek's crew began to question his approach. "Maybe the guy's not worth it," one of them suggested after another failed attempt to provoke Ryan. Derek scowled. "Everyone's worth it," he snapped. "Nobody ignores me and gets away with it." Despite Derek's relentless efforts, Ryan's routine didn't change. Every morning, he woke up early, made his bed, and joined the line for breakfast. He ate quickly and without complaint, even when the food was barely edible. During free time, he walked the yard, staying on the edges where it was quieter. He didn't join any groups, didn't make friends, and didn't seem to mind being alone. For Ryan, it was as if Rivertown Penitentiary was just another place, another part of life to endure. But for Derek, it was personal. Every time Ryan walked away without reacting, every time he stayed silent in the face of Derek's bullying, it felt like a challenge. It was as if Ryan was silently saying, "You can't touch me." And that was something Derek couldn't tolerate. Derek's frustration simmered like a pot about to boil over. In Rivertown Penitentiary, Derek the Hammer Reynolds was king. He ruled the yard with an iron fist, taking pride in the way he broke people down physically, mentally, emotionally. Fear was his currency, and he was rich. But Ryan Carter? He was a mystery. It wasn't just the quietness that bothered Derek. It wasn't the way Ryan avoided confrontation, kept to himself, or walked away from fights. It was something deeper and unshakable calmness that seemed almost unnatural. No matter what Derek did, Ryan never flinched, never panicked. And that infuriated him. It happened on a sweltering afternoon in the weight room. The air was thick with the smell of sweat and rust, the clang of metal weights echoing through the small space. Derek had been watching Ryan out of the corner of his eye, waiting for an opportunity. Ryan was in the corner, quietly doing push-ups on the concrete floor. He didn't touch the weights, didn't show off like the other inmates. But there was something methodical about the way he moved, as if every push-up was calculated, deliberate. Derek saw his chance. "Hey, Carter," he barked, his voice booming over the noise. Ryan didn't look up, finishing his last push-up before standing and turning to face him. "You think you're better than us, don't you?" Derek sneered, stepping closer. His massive frame towered over Ryan, who barely came up to his shoulders. Ryan said nothing, his calm eyes meeting Derek's fiery glare. Derek shoved him hard, his palm slamming into Ryan's chest with enough force to send him stumbling backward into a bench. The room went silent. Every inmate stopped what they were doing, their eyes darting between Derek and Ryan. It wasn't often someone stood up to Derek or was forced to. Ryan stood slowly, brushing off his prison-issued shirt. His movements were smooth, unhurried. He looked at Derek and said, in a voice barely louder than a whisper, "Is that all?" The tension in the room was electric. A wave of murmurs rippled through the crowd. "Did he just?" one inmate whispered to another. Derek's face turned crimson, his fists clenching at his sides. "You think you're tough, huh?" Ryan didn't respond. For a moment, Derek thought about swinging at him, but something stopped him. Maybe it was the way Ryan stood balanced, his feet firmly planted, his posture relaxed but ready. Or maybe it was the look in Ryan's eyes, not fear, not anger, but something that made Derek hesitate. Derek sneered, spitting on the ground. "You're not worth it," he growled, storming out of the weight room. It wasn't just Derek who noticed something different about Ryan. Over the next few weeks, the other inmates began to see it too. Ryan moved through the prison like a ghost, quiet, observant, untouchable. He never started trouble, but trouble seemed to find him. And every time, he handled it with the same calm indifference that had started to unnerve even Derek's crew. One afternoon, in the middle of the yard, a fight broke out between two inmates. It was a typical scuffle, shouts, fists flying, a small crowd gathering to watch. Ryan happened to be walking nearby when one of the fighters threw a wild punch. The punch missed its intended target and came hurtling toward Ryan's face. Without missing a beat, Ryan tilted his head slightly to the side, the punch grazing past him harmlessly. His reaction was so smooth, so effortless, that it almost didn't seem real. "Did you see that?" one of Derek's crew whispered later. "It's like he knew it was coming." "He's just lucky," another replied. But his voice lacked conviction. Derek's crew was loyal, but they weren't blind. They started paying closer attention to Ryan, watching him in the yard, the mess hall, the showers. And the more they watched, the more questions they had. "Man, he never trips," one of them said during a card game in the common area. "I've been watching him. No matter where he's walking, he's always steady. Like he's, I don't know, aware of everything." Another nodded. "And have you noticed the way he eats? He's not like the rest of us, wolfing it down. He chews slow, like he's tasting it, even though the food here's garbage." "Yeah, and what about that thing in the yard last week?" a third chimed in. "That punch was coming right at him, and he just moved. Didn't even look surprised." Derek, overhearing the conversation, slammed his fist on the table. "He's nothing," he barked. "Just a punk who thinks he's smarter than the rest of us. And if you all keep talking like that, I'll show you just how tough he really is. The crew fell silent, but the seed of doubt had been planted. The library was one of the few places in Rivertown where inmates could find a sliver of peace. Most didn't bother with it, but Ryan spent a lot of time there, flipping through books on philosophy, history, and martial arts. One afternoon, Derek stormed in, his crew trailing behind him. Ryan was sitting at a table, a book open in front of him. "What are you reading, Carter?" Derek asked, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Ryan glanced up, his expression as calm as ever. "Sun Tzu," he replied. Derek blinked. "What?" "The Art of War," Ryan said, holding up the book. "It's about strategy." Derek snatched the book from his hands, flipping through the pages. "This is garbage," he said, tossing it onto the table. Ryan didn't react. "It's just a book," he said. But Derek wasn't satisfied. He leaned closer, his voice low and threatening. "You trying to play games with me, Carter? Trying to act smart?" Ryan met his gaze. "No games," he said simply. Derek clenched his fists, but before he could act, a guard entered the library, eyeing the group suspiciously. Derek growled under his breath and walked away, but the encounter left him more frustrated than ever. Over time, the little things about Ryan began to add up. He was always calm, no matter the situation. He never lost his temper, never raised his voice. He moved with a quiet confidence that didn't fit the image of a man who had just landed in Rivertown. And then there were the rumors. Someone said they saw him shadowboxing in his cell, one inmate whispered. "Shadowboxing?" "Yeah, like a boxer. Said his movements were fast, real fast. Like he knew what he was doing." The stories spread, growing more exaggerated with each retelling. Some said Ryan had been a professional fighter on the outside. Others claimed he was an undercover agent, sent to Rivertown to spy on the inmates. The truth was, no one knew who Ryan Carter really was. Derek spotted Ryan sitting on a bench, quietly flipping through a tattered book he'd brought from the library. The sight of him calm, detached, completely unfazed made Derek's teeth clench. "That's it," Derek growled to his crew. "It ends today." He stood, his massive frame casting a long shadow over the yard. As he moved, inmates began to notice. Conversation stopped, and all eyes turned to watch. "Carter!" Derek's voice boomed, cutting through the noise like a whip. Ryan looked up slowly, his face as unreadable as ever. "Get up," Derek barked. "Time to show everyone what you're really made of." The yard fell silent. Ryan didn't move at first. He closed his book carefully, setting it beside him on the bench. Then, with deliberate slowness, he stood. "Derek," he said quietly, "you don't want to do this." The crowd murmured at the audacity of the statement. No one talked to Derek like that, not without consequences. Derek's laughter was loud and harsh. "You think I'm scared of you? You're nothing, Carter. Just another punk who doesn't know his place." Ryan tilted his head slightly, his expression calm. "Maybe you should reconsider." "Enough talk." Derek roared, slamming his fists together. "Let's see what you've got." The inmates quickly formed a circle, the makeshift arena buzzing with anticipation. Jeers and shouts rang out as they jostled for a better view. Even the guards seemed entertained, their hands resting idly on their batons as they watched the unfolding spectacle. Derek stepped into the circle, cracking his knuckles and grinning like a predator. "Come on, Carter. Show us you're more than just a quiet little mouse." Ryan sighed, stepping into the circle with the same measured calm that had come to define him. Derek wasted no time. With a roar, he lunged forward, swinging a massive hook aimed straight at Ryan's jaw. But it never connected. In a flash, Ryan sidestepped the punch, his movements so smooth and precise that it seemed like he'd anticipated the strike long before Derek threw it. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Derek snarled, swinging again, a wild, powerful blow meant to intimidate as much as to injure. This time, Ryan didn't just dodge. He caught Derek's wrist mid-swing, his grip like iron. With a sharp twist, Ryan spun Derek's arm in a motion so fast and fluid that the larger man was forced to his knees, his face contorted in pain. The crowd erupted in shock. Inmates who had placed bets on Derek winning easily were now questioning everything they thought they knew about Ryan Carter. "What the hell just happened?" one inmate muttered. "Did you see that? He moved like a pro," another whispered. Derek's crew exchanged uneasy glances. For the first time, their leader looked vulnerable. Derek tried to recover, using his brute strength to yank his arm free. But Ryan's grip was unyielding. With a quick, calculated movement, Ryan swept Derek's legs out from under him, sending the hulking man crashing to the ground. Derek scrambled to his feet, his face a mask of rage. "You got lucky," he spat, charging at Ryan like a bull. Ryan waited, his posture calm, his eyes locked on Derek. As the larger man barreled toward him, Ryan shifted his weight slightly, pivoting just enough to let Derek's momentum carry him past. Before Derek could regain his balance, Ryan struck a flurry of precise, lightning-fast movements. A sharp jab to the ribs, a quick strike to the knee, and a final blow to the shoulder sent Derek sprawling to the ground, groaning in pain. For a moment, the yard was completely silent. Ryan stepped back, adjusting his collar as if nothing had happened. He glanced at Derek, who was struggling to sit up, his face a mixture of shock and humiliation. "You might want to rethink who you pick on next time," Ryan said calmly. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried enough weight to be heard by everyone in the circle. The inmates stared at Ryan, their disbelief slowly giving way to something else: respect. In a place where strength was everything, Ryan had just proven himself in a way no one could ignore. Derek's crew hesitated, unsure whether to help their fallen leader or pretend they didn't know him. One of the guards finally stepped forward, blowing his whistle. "Break it up," he shouted, though his tone lacked urgency. Even the guards seemed stunned by what they'd witnessed. Ryan turned and walked away, the circle parting to let him through. He picked up his book from the bench and returned to his spot, opening it as if nothing had happened. The fight didn't just change Derek's reputation, it cemented Ryan's as a man not to be underestimated. "He's trained," one inmate whispered later. "No way someone moves like that without years of practice. Did you see his form? That wasn't just instinct. That was skill." The rumors spread like wildfire. Some said Ryan had been a martial arts champion on the outside. Others claimed he was ex-military, a special forces operative sent undercover. Ryan, as always, said nothing to confirm or deny the stories. The events of that fateful afternoon spread through Rivertown Penitentiary like wildfire. By the time dinner was served, every inmate knew what had happened in the yard. Derek the Hammer Reynolds, the self-proclaimed king of the prison, had been toppled, and by someone who didn't even raise his voice. Derek limped back to his cell that evening, his crew trailing behind him like a defeated army. His usual swagger was gone, replaced by a hunched posture and the dull weight of humiliation. For a man who thrived on power and fear, the loss was more than physical, it was existential. The whispers were everywhere. In the cafeteria, inmates stole glances at Derek and then looked away, their smirks barely hidden. "The Hammer got nailed," one inmate muttered to another, sending their table into stifled laughter. Derek clenched his fists at the sound, but he didn't react. He couldn't. Even his crew, once loyal to a fault, began to drift. They stayed near him out of habit, but their eyes often wandered to Ryan Carter, who sat alone at his usual table, quietly eating as if nothing had changed. Ryan's routine remained the same. He woke early, worked in the library, exercised, and kept to himself. But the way others treated him had shifted. In the past, Ryan was ignored, dismissed as just another quiet inmate who wouldn't last long in Rivertown's brutal hierarchy. Now, he commanded respect without saying a word. When Ryan walked through the yard, conversations paused. Inmates stepped aside to let him pass, their expressions a mix of curiosity and awe. Even the guards treated him differently. They were more watchful, careful not to provoke him. Derek, on the other hand, found himself increasingly isolated. His attempts to reassert control over the yard were met with lukewarm support at best. The inmates who once feared him now saw him as vulnerable, and in Rivertown, weakness was a dangerous thing to show. One afternoon, Derek tried to corner a younger inmate near the weight benches, barking his usual threats. The kid looked terrified, but before Derek could escalate, someone stepped in. "Leave him alone," a deep voice said. Derek turned to see Big Lou, another of the yard's power players, standing with his arms crossed. Lou had always stayed out of Derek's way, respecting the unspoken rules of their rival territories. But now, Lou didn't seem to care. "This ain't your business," Derek snapped. "It is now," Lou replied, his tone calm but firm. Derek backed off, muttering under his breath. But the message was clear, his reign was over. Ryan had no interest in taking Derek's place as the yard's top dog. He didn't seek power or alliances. Yet, in his quiet way, he became a figure many inmates turned to. It started small. A few inmates approached him in the library, asking for help with letters to their families or advice on parole hearings. Ryan helped without hesitation, his answers thoughtful and straightforward. Word spread quickly. "He's different," one inmate said after Ryan helped him draft a letter to his daughter. "Doesn't act like he's better than anyone." Soon, even the tougher inmates began to respect Ryan not out of fear, but out of genuine admiration. Despite his defeat, Derek wasn't ready to let go of his former status. Weeks after the yard fight, he confronted Ryan in the laundry room. "I'm not done with you," Derek growled, stepping close enough to invade Ryan's space. Ryan didn't flinch. He folded a clean shirt and placed it neatly on a pile before turning to face Derek. "Yes, you are," Ryan said calmly, his tone steady but final. The words hung in the air like a challenge. Derek's fists clenched, his face reddening with anger. But he didn't move. Something in Ryan's eyes stopped him, a quiet intensity that spoke louder than any threat. Derek turned and stormed out, slamming the door behind him. Over time, the yard became less volatile. Without Derek stirring up trouble, the tension that had once defined daily life began to ease. Arguments still happened, and fights still broke out. It was a prison, after all, but the constant sense of chaos diminished. Many inmates credited the change to Ryan. His presence alone seemed to discourage violence. "You see Carter watching, you think twice about doing something stupid," one inmate said. "Man doesn't even have to say a word," another added. "That's real power." For Derek, the loss of his reputation was unbearable. He tried to rally his crew one last time, urging them to take back control of the yard. But they weren't interested. "You had your shot," one of them said bluntly. "You blew it." Defeated, Derek retreated further into himself. He spent more time in his cell, rarely venturing into the yard. The man who once ruled Rivertown with an iron fist was now a shadow of his former self. The guards noticed the change as well. Derek's disciplinary record, once filled with incidents of aggression and intimidation, became spotless. Ryan, on the other hand, became a model inmate. His quiet discipline and willingness to help others didn't go unnoticed. The warden even called him into his office one day. "I've been hearing good things about you, Carter," the warden said, studying him carefully. Ryan nodded but said nothing. "Keep it up," the warden added. "Men like you don't belong here forever." Months passed, and Rivertown continued to shift. The inmates who had once been ruled by fear found a sense of balance, thanks to Ryan's quiet influence. For Ryan, it wasn't about power or recognition. It was about survival and maybe, just maybe, finding a way to leave Rivertown better than he'd found it. Reflective or inspiring closing. In the quiet hours of the night, as the hum of the penitentiary settled into a steady rhythm, Ryan Carter would sit by his small cell window, gazing at the slice of moonlit sky beyond the bars. It was a moment he had come to treasure, a fleeting reminder that even in confinement, there were still glimpses of freedom. He wasn't the loudest man in Rivertown Penitentiary. Far from it. Ryan preferred to stay in the background, avoiding unnecessary attention. But the lessons he had imparted, without ever intending to, had changed the fabric of the prison in ways that few could have imagined. In a world where fists spoke louder than words, Ryan had shown the inmates and even the guards that true strength wasn't about dominance. It wasn't about throwing punches or shouting commands. Strength was something quieter, something steadier. It was in the way he carried himself, shoulders back but not puffed out, gaze steady but not confrontational. He walked the yard with purpose, not seeking to prove anything to anyone. And yet, his presence was a challenge to every false sense of power around him. Derek Reynolds, once the undisputed ruler of the yard, had retreated into himself. He no longer bullied weaker inmates, no longer barked orders or demanded respect. Though he remained a towering figure, his aggression had dulled, replaced by something closer to reflection or resignation. Others in the prison began to follow Ryan's example. They saw how he resolved conflicts without raising his voice, how he earned respect without forcing it. Small disputes that would have once escalated into fights now ended with a quiet word or a meaningful glance. Ryan doesn't waste energy, one inmate said. He's smart about it. Makes you think twice before you do something dumb. It wasn't just the inmates who noticed. The guards, too, began to see the shift. Tensions in the yard eased. Fewer fights broke out. The air felt less oppressive. One day, a young inmate named Jordan approached Ryan in the library. Jordan was barely 20, wide-eyed and scared, with a sentence that stretched longer than his years alive. Hey, Ryan. Jordan stammered, holding a book awkwardly in his hands. Do you think you could help me? I'm trying to write to my mom, but I don't really know what to say. Ryan looked up from his own reading and studied the boy for a moment. He nodded, pulling out a piece of paper. Start with how you feel, Ryan said. The rest will come. It was a small act, but it meant everything to Jordan. Soon, others followed. Inmates seeking advice, help with letters, or even just a moment of calm in the storm that was Rivertown. Ryan gave what he could, not out of obligation, but because it was the right thing to do. Ryan's actions taught a lesson that no fight could. Power was not about brute strength. It was about control over your emotions, your actions, and the situations around you. When Derek had swung at him in the yard, Ryan could have destroyed him in an instant. But he didn't. Instead, he had calculated every move, using only the force necessary to end the fight without escalating it further. That restraint, that ability to hold back when it mattered most, was what set him apart. It wasn't just about winning, it was about showing there was another way. As the months turned into years, Ryan continued to walk the delicate balance of prison life. He knew he wasn't a hero. He wasn't there to save anyone. But in his quiet, unassuming way, he had become a beacon of hope. For Ryan, the journey wasn't just about surviving Rivertown. It was about mastering himself, his past, his regrets, and his future. He often thought about the world outside, about the people he'd left behind and the life he might still have when he got out. He didn't dwell on it, though. Instead, he focused on what he could control, the here and now. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the yard in golden light, an older inmate named Marcus approached Ryan. Carter, Marcus said, his voice gruff but warm, you've got people wondering how you do it. How you stay so calm in a place like this. Ryan looked at him, a faint smile playing on his lips. You don't waste energy on things that don't matter, he said simply. Marcus chuckled, shaking his head. Wish I'd learned that lesson a long time ago. Ryan didn't respond. He didn't need to. Ryan's time at Rivertown Penitentiary would eventually come to an end. But long after he was gone, his influence remained. The inmates who had once fought over scraps of respect now found themselves searching for better ways to coexist. Guards who had once dismissed prisoners as irredeemable began to see glimpses of humanity in the men they watched over. And Derek Reynolds? He found himself thinking back to that day in the yard more often than he cared to admit. He never spoke to Ryan again, but in his heart, he knew he had learned something invaluable. Sometimes, losing teaches you more than winning ever could. Sometimes, the strongest person in the room isn't the one shouting the loudest or swinging the hardest punch. Strength isn't about breaking others, it's about holding yourself together when everything around you threatens to fall apart. Ryan Carter proved that power doesn't come from brute force. It comes from control, from discipline, and from knowing exactly when to act. In a place where chaos ruled, Ryan was the calm in the storm. And in his quiet way, he reminded everyone at Rivertown Penitentiary of a simple truth: real power is not in dominating others, but in mastering yourself. And that kind of strength, it can never be taken away.